Thank you so much for inviting me here to Chingford this evening. It's an honour always to talk about the Matchgirls, and hopefully as I go through the slides you'll understand why I'm quite so interested in it myself. So here we go. This gives you a big clue. I'm the great-granddaughter of one of the strike leaders of the strike in 1888. So really this talk is maybe a little slightly different to one you might hear from just a historian, because it has my own personal slant on it and the story of my great-grandmother and how I discovered it. So Sarah Chapman, this is my great-grandmother, and I had a picture of her on my wall for years and years, her and my granddad. I had no idea that she'd been involved in this strike, and back in 2016 I was doing some normal family research, and our family name is Dearman, and so I thought we had Sarah's husband came from 3 lines of silk weavers in the East End, and so we thought, is there a Huguenot connection, de Armand, Dearman? So I went back, having had lunch with my cousins one day, and they said, go back, please just go back and see if you can find this link with the Huguenots. So I just type into Google Sarah Chapman and Charles Henry Dearman, who was the son of the silk weavers, and this post popped up. So this is it was on Ancestry, and as you can see, it says you know that Sarah was one of the Matchgirls, and I read this and I was incredulous. I could not believe it, and I was working that day. It was a Monday. I was meant to be working from home, and I just spent the whole day googling Matchgirls. I did know a little bit about the story, but I learned an awful lot more that day, and I just couldn't believe that this little old lady that had been sitting in a picture on my wall for all these years had been involved in this landmark strike back in the late 1800s. So my next quest was to find Anna Robinson, because obviously she'd written this post in 2003. I didn't read it in 2016, so I had to do a little bit more detective work to find Anna, because I wanted to know, why did she want to know? What was she up to? And it turned out she was actually doing an MA postgraduate thesis about the Matchgirls and for Ruskin College, and she actually published it back in 2004, and she wrote this thesis all about my great-grandmother. She was the subject of it, so of course I suddenly had this wealth of information when I found her. And Anna is now, she's Dr. Anna Robinson. She's actually a senior lecturer at University of East London, and she's also now a good friend, and she's also a trustee on the charity that we set up. So that's kind of a bit of the background of how I found out. So actually, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride for the last sort of 6 years since I found out. And what I'm going to tell you tonight is what we've done since, really. So just to tell you a little bit about Sarah, she was born, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Mile End and the East End at all, but Sarah was born in a road called Alfred Terrace, and then by the time she was 9, they'd moved up here to Swan Court. Now this road here is Mile End Road, and if you keep going along here and off the screen and up here somewhere, you'll find the factory, the Bow factory. And so if I just overlay that with a modern day map, that doesn't really tell you an awful lot more, but apart from the fact that this is now, Alfred Terrace is now Shandy Street. So if you ever feel like going down there to walk in the footsteps of Matchgirls, this is where Sarah was born, and this is where her and her family lived. She was 5 of 7 children, the 5th of 7 children, sorry, and quite unusual for those days that actually her family were quite stable. And I think this is part of the reason that Anna chose Sarah as her subject matter, because a lot of them moved home quite often. You know, they couldn't afford the rent, they had to move on, you know, various different reasons, they lost their job. But she was in a fairly stable family surroundings. She had a mum and a dad. Sarah Ann Mackenzie was her mum. She also worked at the match factory. Her older sister worked at the factory. Her brothers were dockers. Her father, Samuel Chapman, who was actually born in Hornchurch in Essex, he worked on the docks and sometimes in the local breweries. So they were fairly unusual in that. And actually Sarah was to stay here in, it was a little place called Swan Court, until 1891. And so that was after the strike had happened. So she was there for quite some considerable time. And this is actually this is really sad, because there's Victorian buildings either side of this building, but this one's obviously quite modern, and it's the American Snooker Hall, and this is where Swan Court was. This is where Sarah lived. So it seems every time I go to search where my ancestors lived in the East End, it's always been replaced by something else, probably due to bomb, etc. But so anyway, that's where she was. So this is the factory as it was back in the day, and it's on Fairfield Road in Bow. And this is very, very much as it is today, actually. So if I just overlay it with a modern day map, here's me back in 2016, just after I discovered it. I had that photo taken there because I quite like the idea that I was standing just where my great-grandmother would have gone into work. And this factory is now a gated community, so you can't just go in there. I mean, much of the original features of the factory are still there. But it is a gated community. It's got 700 flats, and you know, unless you know somebody in there, you can't get in there. I've been very lucky to have a tour of inside, and there are some original features of the original factory, including some quite evocative places, such as there's some tiles with kind of black splatter marks on the walls where they had explosions. And I was told that it was quite often that they had a glass roof on the factory because they had explosions so often. It was much easier to replace the glass roof than an ordinary roof. So, yeah, I think the conditions there were fairly horrific at times. So just to tell you a little bit more then about the conditions, they had very low pay. I mean, it was quite common for the girls to go home with 4 or 5 shillings a week. They may have started out with more, but they had fines and deductions. So they would do things like go to the toilet without permission. I know that you're allowed to go to the toilet, I just heard Gary say so. But they would also, if they had dirty feet or if they dropped matches accidentally, any minor thing, that they could then be fined, and so obviously then find themselves taking home even less pay. They also, if they had any grievances, they wouldn't ever make it to the management. They had foremen who were quite physically abusive, and they would sort of clip them around the ear and tell them to get back on with their work. And so any complaints they had didn't really go any further. So also some of them, particularly the home workers that made the matchboxes, etc., they had to buy their own materials, their own glue and string and etc., all of the materials, which is, you know, was terrible really. I mean, it was sweated labour. There's no other way of describing it. And they had to work 6 days a week, so Monday to Saturday every week, and they'd start at something like 6:30 and work right through to 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening. And there wasn't much respite. And also they were a very young workforce. So some of the workers were as young as 6. So some of the young lads that used to carry boxes and do errands were only 6 years old. And many of them were teenagers as well. Now, my Sarah was actually one of the older ones. She was 25. And she'd been working, we know she worked at the factory as early as 1881, and she was 25 by 1888, and she would become something called a booker. Now, if anybody can tell me what a booker is, I would love to know. I've never found out what she actually did, but she was the highest paid worker in the factory the week before the strike. She took home something like 14 shillings. And I don't know whether she was just really good at dodging the fines, or whether she had got herself into an elevated position because of her maturity and her experience, and she was able to therefore have more money. So, you know, it could be that actually could be said that Sarah had more to lose than most, because she'd been there for a long time, she was on good pay, and she came from a stable background, so therefore she wouldn't have wanted to easily give up her job. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about what they did. I mean, it was, sorry, I hope you are all hearing me okay. You're hearing me online okay? Yeah, okay, good. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. They did do other good things outside of work. They knew how to enjoy themselves. They were a feisty bunch of girls. They knew how to have fun, and they really liked to dress up. And one of the things they did was wore feathers in their hat. Perhaps not quite this grand, but this is why we have the feather display here. And what they liked to do was they had a feather club, and they would each pay in a penny or whatever, and then once every so often they would draw lots, and whoever won the pot would quite often use the money to go out and buy another feather for their hat, so that they could go out on a Saturday night down to the music halls. And if they couldn't afford to go into the music halls, they would just walk down the road singing the songs anyway as loud as they could. And I'll just read you a couple of quotes from commentators of the day, because these are quite evocative, I think. So Clara Collett in 1886, she noted that they buy their clothes and feathers, especially the latter, by forming clubs. 7 or 8 of them will join together, paying a shilling a week each, drawing lots, and decide who should have the money. Then Montague Williams commented how the match girls come out very strong on a Saturday night, when any number of them can be found at the Paragon Music Hall in the Mile End Road, the Foresters Music Hall in Cambridge Road, and the Seabright at Hackney. They seem to know by heart the words of all the popular songs of the day, and their homeward journey, though musical, is decidedly noisy. And then this last picture here may intrigue you. This is some girls, not necessarily match girls, but you can use your imagination, outside a factory, rolling up their sleeves and having a bit of a fight. So I'll just read, to explain what's happening here, I'll read you this quote from, from George Duckworth. He said, "Bryant and May have a rough set of girls. There are 2,000 of them when they're busy, rough and rowdy, but not bad morally. They fight with their fists to settle their differences. Not in the factory, for that's forbidden, but in the streets when they leave work in the evening. A ring is formed and they fight like men and are not interfered with by the police." So that gives you a flavour of the spirit of the girls. I mean, they knew how to stand up for themselves, and they weren't going to be walked all over. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour of what led up to this strike, what was in the air at the time. So back in 1871, there was a match tax protest. So the then Chancellor, Robert Lowe, tried to introduce a tax on match boxes of half a penny a box. And you can understand that everybody relied on matches in those days. I mean, everybody needed match to light their their fires, for warmth and to be able to see. And there was a big protest. And even Queen Victoria apparently wrote to Robert Lowe and to say how ludicrous this was. But the match workers and the bosses, encouraged by the bosses in fact, marched down onto Parliament to actually protest against this. And even everyday people joined in, and there was a public outcry, and in the end he actually had to withdraw this plan, which he'd actually labelled ex luce lucellum, which means out of light a little profit. And to this day, this little emblem, which is his ex luce lucellum, can be seen on the side of the factory. If you go down there to Fairfield Road, you can see this. And also this picture of a march, which was drawn some years later after the match tax protest by W.D. Almond. This is actually quite often linked to the actual Matchgirls Strike of 1888, but in fact it's not. It was drawn in recognition of the match tax protest, which was much earlier. But you can see that that there was a history of standing up and fighting for what you think is right. Even before that. And another little story that may or may not be true, but it's in folklore now, so we have to let you know what it is. But there's a church down near the factory. It's called St Mary's Church in Bow, and outside is this statue of Gladstone. And Bryant and May got on very well with William Gladstone, and they decided to buy him a statue. And it's reported that they took money from the girls' wages to help pay for this statue. And they didn't like this very much, as you can imagine. So the story goes that when the unveiling of the statue took place, they cut their own hands and arms, and they marked the statue with their own blood, because they felt they'd paid for it with their own blood. And even to this day, his hand is painted red. So some mystery person goes up there every now and again, scales the statue and paints his hand red. So it's a lovely story. And I mean, I know that statues over the last few years have caused a little bit of a discussion. Gladstone, in his time, mostly influenced by his father, had been involved in slavery. And I know there have been some calls to have this statue taken down. But we think actually it's part of the story of the Matchgirls. And actually what we should do is probably put a plaque up to explain the story of the Red Hand, keep him there, he's part of the story, and and just explain to people why his hand is red. And it just embellishes the local history, and it gives people a bit more of an education, rather than just a gut reaction of just pulling everything down without knowing the full story. So I think he did do quite a lot of good things as well, poor old Gladstone, so he wasn't all bad. But anyway, all of these things were, other events that had happened to the Matchgirls, and they had also gone out on strike several times, I think maybe up to 3 times previously, in the early 70s and 80s, to no avail. They just basically gone out on strike. They had nobody to stand up for them. They just got taken back to work because they needed the money. They needed to, just go back. So they failed, really. So what was different in 1888? So there was a group of people that you may have heard of, the Fabian Society. They had members such as George Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb, Clementina Black, Annie Besant, Herbert Burrows, a whole host of very high-profile reformers of the day, and they wanted to change how things were for everyday working-class people. And so they had a fateful meeting, actually, on the 15th of June, 1888. These are the minutes. I know, I realise you can't see them very, very clearly, but I'd be happy to send a copy to anybody that really wants to read them. But basically, in this meeting, Clementina Black kicked things off by talking about the state of female labour in particular, and how women were not treated very well in the workplace and not paid very much. And then after that, Henry Hyde Champion stood up, and he told people in the meeting about the high dividends that Bryant and May paid to their shareholders, while at the same time paying like pittance wages to their staff and to their workers. And so he proposed the boycott of the purchase of Bryant and May matches, and it was passed unanimously. So that's they all decided, every single person at that meeting that night. And to me, this is a very, very important step, because what happened next was Annie Besant and Herbert Burrows, the next day, they went off to the factory and they thought, well, we've heard about these, the rumours of these conditions. We're going to go and speak to some of the workers ourselves. So they went to the factory and they spoke to some of the workers outside, and they freely told them everything that happened to them, how awful it was, the abuse, the low pay, the long hours, everything, and not least the phosphorus that they had to work with. So this is probably, if anybody knows about the Matchgirl story, this is the bit that you'll know about the phosphorus, because they had to make the matches with white phosphorus. There was red phosphorus available by this time, and that was much safer, and it didn't cause the same medical problems. But it was obviously cheaper to use white phosphorus, so Bryant and May chose to use the white phosphorus. Now, the dangers of white phosphorus have been known since 1845, when a chap in Vienna had actually identified 22 cases of osteonecrosis, or fozzy jaw, as it's more locally known. And even Charles Dickens wrote about it in his papers in 1852 to say that this was a really dangerous substance. But still, it was used in the factory at Bryant and May, and they didn't actually stop using it until 1901. And in the UK, we didn't ban it until the 1st of January 1911. So all of those years we knew of the dangers, but yet we still kept using it because it was cheap. Anyway, I digress slightly. That's the background of fozzy jaw. But so this was one of the things that they really worried about as well. So Annie wrote about all of this she had a weekly magazine called The Link, and she wrote about this, and she called it White Slavery in London. And she didn't hold anything back. She wrote everything in this article. And of course, she then went to the factory. She gave the girls copies of it, and she made it quite known that she wanted everybody to read this article. Well, of course, the directors at the factory read it, and they were furious, and they threatened libel action against Annie. And the other thing they did, which would perhaps put the final nail in their coffin, was they actually produced a document where they wanted every worker in the factory to sign to say what Annie had said in her article was not true. And they all refused. They said, we're not doing that because it's true. They finally knew that they had some outside support and they were not going to, pass up this opportunity. So they refused to sign it. And there was a few days of unrest, and then this culminated finally in a sacking. So some girls were sacked, and that was absolutely it. They all just walked out. They were just absolutely furious, and they thought, we're not putting up with this anymore. So there were about 1,400 workers there at the time, and I mean there were men, boys, girls, young girls, women, all the whole mix, but they were predominantly women and young females. So that's hence the term match girls. Just before they walked out on strike, one of them wrote this anonymous letter to Annie. We call it the Dear Lady letter. I'm happy to share these slides with Gary and co afterwards if anybody wants to read it. I won't read this whole letter, but it's basically them recognising that Annie was helping them and, thanking her for the help and support she'd given them so far. And they didn't want to get her into trouble, but they were also very, very glad. They say things like, thanks for helping us poor girls, etc. They really did appreciate her help and support. Annie received this letter and probably thought, what are they talking about? I don't know why they've sent me this letter. But the next day, she was to find out because her office was in Bouverie Street, which is just off Fleet Street. And 200 of the workers, the day after the strike, so on the 6th of July, they marched down from Bow to Bouverie Street and just basically rocked up outside her office. And, like, Annie, we've gone out on strike. And so she looked out the window, well, I can't speak to 200 of you, send 3 up. So they sent 3 of the girls up. And one of them was, so it was Mrs. Mary Cummings, Mrs. Mary Knowles, and Sarah Chapman. And my theory is that Mrs. Mary Cummings and Mrs. Mary Knowles were probably slightly more mature than the rest of the girls because they were married. Sarah also, I know, was 25 at the time. She wasn't married at the time, but she was perhaps more mature. And as I said, had been at the factory quite a long time. So perhaps they thought, let's elect, 3 kind of women to represent us. So they sent them up to the office. They spoke to Annie, and she, although she didn't agree with strike action, she preferred to affect change by reform, but she did agree to help them. So they then, set about forming plans for a strike committee, etc. And a chap called Harry Hobart suggested that they set up a strike fund register. So this is an extract from the strike fund register. There were about 700 odd girls on here, and boys. And you can see Sarah is here as entry 198. They made quite a few mistakes in this because obviously the girls would just go up and say their details and they'd write them down. So there's quite a lot of transcription errors. For instance, there was another girl called Kate Slater on the strike register, and we later found out that actually her name was Kate Sclater, and she was actually born in Southampton, which is where I live. And so we were quite pleased to find that out, and we've got quite a little bit of a local following now in Southampton because people are interested that they have their very own match girl there too. So anyway, they had this strike register, and lots of different people helped support this, so that they gradually got the public on side. So the Pall Mall Gazette and the Star newspapers were supportive from the outset. They published letters to support the match girls. And there was even a play that was put on in the West End to support them, to raise funds for the strike fund. And to start with, the Times were not behind them. They were absolutely thinking they were just poor little girls who didn't know what they were doing, and just ignore them, they'll go away kind of thing. But even the Times gradually realised that, because they went out and they spoke in public. They went to the Mile End Waste, which is a little area where near... Actually, if you go there today in Mile End, there's the Salvation Army, William Booth statue and his wife. They're both there. And back in the day, in 1888, there was a big open area where the match girls used to meet and have rallies and tell the public about what was going on. And also they met in other places as well, Charrington's Hall, which is, oops, I haven't got a picture of Charrington's Hall, I thought I did. Maybe that's later. Anyway, so they would meet in public places. The London Trades Council got to hear about this and they gave their support. Toynbee Hall gave their support, and gradually, you know, they managed to get more and more people on board. And Annie Besant, with her connections, she took them on a march. 56 of them marched down to Parliament from Bow, and there's a vivid description of their journey from Bow all the way to Parliament, how excited they were to go there. And when they got there, 12 of them, including the committee members, so including my Sarah, were invited into the lobby, and they met two MPs, Charles Conybeare and Robert Cunningham Graham. So they were actually being listened to in high up places. And another friend of Annie and also MP of Northampton, Charles Bradlaugh, he actually stood up and spoke for them in Parliament as well. So you can see, with the help of these social reformers, you know, the girls knew how to stand up for themselves, but with the help of this external forces of the reformers, they actually, you know, formed a kind of a fairly big force. And to my mind, everybody always talks about Annie Besant, and she really did help them. I'm not putting her down in any way. She did help them. But I think it's really important that we remember these names. These were the 8 girls that were on the strike committee. And I think it's really important that we try to remember some of their names. And in fact, we've got awareness ribbons, which you're welcome to come and take one. They're free, awareness ribbons. And on the back of the card, we've got the names of all of the strike and union committee members. And I think it's, you know, it wouldn't be too hard for us to remember. We can't remember 1,400 names. We can't even remember the 700 on the strike register, but we can remember 13 names. And 8 of them were these girls: Mary Knowles, Mary Driscoll, Jane Wakeling, Kate Sclater, Sarah Chapman, Eliza Martin, Mary Cummings, Alice Francis, who were on the strike committee. And I think, you know, they worked as a collective. They made the strike work because of their collective, but they were individuals. And of course, at the time, the papers put articles out about the strike, but they didn't mention their names. They were just called the Match Girls. They were just called the girls. The only name that got in the paper was Annie Besant. And, you know, so I think it's really important we remember those. Charrington's Hall, this is one of the places that they would meet. And there's a little small hall just down here that Mr. Charrington allowed them to meet in. And just to give you a few more details on what they actually wanted from this strike, they weren't after a huge pay rise or anything like that. What they wanted was just decent working conditions. They wanted to have the 3 pennies that were restored to the packers who'd had 3 pence deducted from their wages. They wanted to have the paintbrushes, deductions, etc., as I told you, for materials to be stopped. They wanted fines to be abolished. They wanted to be able to form a union. They wanted some barrows so that they didn't have to walk around carrying these heavy boxes on their heads. They wanted somewhere separate to eat their sandwiches at lunchtime, so they didn't have to eat and breathe in the phosphorus. So, you know, fairly simple demands, really, and it wasn't really a lot to ask. But with all the support that they'd gained and the momentum that they gathered with the public, Bryant and May directors obviously felt the pressure, and they conceded to have a meeting with the London Trades Council. And during that meeting, the London Trades Council got them to agree to meet the Committee of Girls. So the next day, on the 17th of July, I think it was, they went in to the board meeting at Bryant and May, these 8 match girls, and they sat down and they told Bryant and May exactly what they wanted, and they agreed to every single demand. And that was like just unbelievable. I mean, it was such, I cannot understate how, you know, how remarkable this was for the time, and what it meant for labour history and, you know, workers everywhere. For all of us really that have ever had a job with good conditions, we have the Match Girls to thank, really, because this is where it started. This is where workers started to say, no, I'm not going to put up with this. I want to have better conditions. So, and also, you know, if you have bad conditions, which I know quite a few people still do in these days, this is an inspiration for those people. You know, you can stand up and make a difference. And so they agreed to their demands. The girls put it to the vote with the rest of the workers. Are you happy with this? They all did, and they were absolutely really overwhelmed by it. And so just 12 days after they'd gone out on strike, 12 days, they won everything, and they went back to work the next day, and it was in all the papers, and it was, it was just marvelous. And quite a lot of you will have heard of the dock strike of 1889, and we all think of that as the beginning of the change. It wasn't. It was this. It was this, because these match girls were the mothers, the daughters, the cousins, the sisters of the dockers. As I told you, my Sarah, her brothers worked at the docks. My great-great-granddad worked at the docks. So they were all mixing together, and we know the dockers supported the match girls. And Ben Tillett, who led the dock strike, he said favourable things about the match girls, and he thought what they did had been brilliant. So they inspired their male counterparts. So these, after they won the strike, 10 days later they held the inaugural meeting of the new Union of Women Matchmakers. Very quickly that title was changed, and they dropped the word women, and it just became the Union of Matchmakers. But nevertheless, the first one, there were 468 people turned up at Stepney Meeting Hall, and they voted in the 12 committee members. And I will just put the names up again because I think it's important. This is my Sarah standing next to Herbert Burrows. That's Annie Besant just here at the beginning, at the front. And we can't put all of the names exactly to the faces, but we know that these are the names, and we know these are the faces. So we can't, if anybody has any links with any people who are descendants of match girls, I'd love to hear it, because I think it would be lovely to discover some of these descendants of these girls. Last but not least, Alice France is here. She's clearly Sarah's friend. They're linked arms there. Now, my dad is still alive, so he's the grandson of Sarah. And I also know that I've discovered the grandson of Alice, and I would really love to recreate this photo of them standing together. I think that would be so lovely. Unfortunately, my dad's in Cornwall at the moment, and Andy's near London, so trying to get them both together is a little bit logistically difficult, but I won't give up. And they, on the night of this inaugural meeting, the girls were so, as a measure of their affection for Annie and Herbert and Harry Hobart, they actually presented them with some little gifts, and they gave Annie a brooch, and they gave scarf pins to Herbert Burrows and Harry Hobart. So you can see that there was a true affection there, and they did really appreciate the help that they'd been given, being introduced to the MPs and etc. So it was a remarkable feat. So just to wrap up before the break, I'll just tell you a little bit about what happened after the strike. I'm very proud of the fact that Sarah was the one that was picked to be the delegate to represent them, their union at the TUC. And at the end of 1888, in November, she went with Annie to St Andrew's Hall in Oxford Street, just off Oxford Street, to the International TUC. And just to give you a flavour of just how incredible this was at the time, a young, humble, woman from the East End who'd probably barely even left Mile End apart from to go to work. And here she was at the International TUC. There were 71 delegates there, only 5 women, and 2 of them were Annie and Sarah. And so, I find that quite incredible. And then a couple of years later, in 1890, Sarah actually travelled up to Liverpool on her own to represent them. So in 1890, Sarah went up to Liverpool on her own for a whole week. And she was so emboldened by that time, she actually felt able to second a motion. So this motion was related to the Truck Act, and the Truck Act was related to having to buy your own materials, etc. And the motion was to stop this practice. So she obviously felt that was close to her heart, and so she seconded that motion. Then Sarah was actually only 13 years after Edith Simcox and Emma Patterson were the very first women ever to go to a TUC meeting. And the TUC itself had only started in 1868, so it was only 20 years old, the TUC movement. And when she went to that second meeting in Liverpool, there were 500 delegates, so the delegates had gone up, but still only 10 women. So to think that, 13 years since the first women, to 13 years later, still only 10 women going. Anyway, so that was, I think that's quite remarkable. But we were invited, my husband and I were invited to the trades union 150th anniversary in Manchester in 2018, and the then president, Sally Hunt, she did her opening address, and she spoke all about the history of the trade union movement, but she particularly highlighted the Match Girls, and she mentioned Sarah Chapman, and it was just such a great moment for me. It's the first time she'd ever had her name mentioned in public, and it was really wonderful. And she ended the speech by lighting a match to honour all of the Match Girls and what they'd done for the trade union movement. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit more about what happened to Sarah after the strike and what I've done as a result of finding out about this. So this picture here is Sarah and her husband, Charles Henry Dearman. Charles was born in Bacon Street, just off Brick Lane, and he was a cabinet maker. And as I said earlier, he came from a long line of silk weavers. So his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather were all called Francis Dearman, and they were all silk weavers. So I'm still quite intrigued in that, but I've been so busy doing this, I haven't had time to look at it for 6 years. Sarah and Charles had 6 children. Unfortunately, 3 of them predeceased Sarah. One was only 10 days old. One had leukemia and died 12 days after her 21st birthday. And another son, he fought in both world wars, and then went on to become a policeman. But then he died the same year as Sarah, but before her, as a result of his war wounds, unfortunately. So when she died, she lived to a ripe old age of 83, which, I mean, given she was born in 1862, I think, to survive till the end of 1945 and live through 2 world wars, through the Blitz, everything. I mean, she never left, apart from when she went to Liverpool. I'm not aware that she ever left the East End. When she married Charles, they moved over from Mile End to Bethnal Green, and she lived there for the rest of her life. So we don't have much by way of tangible connection to Sarah, apart from I guess my dad is the tangible living connection, because he met her excuse me, when he was 3 or 4 years old. Sarah actually gave him a little red train engine, and he remembers going to her house in Bethnal Green. He drew me a picture of it because he doesn't still have the engine, but he remembers going to her house and remembers the evocative smell of the gas mantles and the antimacassars on the, sorry, I'm just going to have a quick drink. Sorry about that. Yeah, the antimacassars on the arms of the chairs, and a huge aspidestra in the corner of the room. So he remembers her very well, and he was only 7 when she died, but he does remember her. And the other quite nice thing as well, not actually from Sarah, but her husband Charles, he made this little box as he was a cabinet maker. He made the box which he gave to my grandfather, who always kept his important papers in it the whole of his life. And then when he died, he gave it to my dad. And although my dad is thankfully still with us, he decided that I should have this box now. So that's quite lovely. And I've now actually got my own grandson 4.5 months ago. So I think that he will be Sarah's great grandson. And one day I'd like to think that I can give that to him. I think he's a bit early to have it yet, but. So the other thing, before I go on to that, so Sarah worked at the factory till after the strike, but then until 1891 when she married Charles. And her and her mother as well at the same time had to move away from Swan Court because her father Samuel died, sadly, and they moved away over to Bromley by Bow. But then she met Charles, and then as I said, she moved to Bethnal Green. But when she got to the end of her life, it was at the end of the war. Nobody had any money. As I said, times were very, very hard at that time. And she was actually buried in Manor Park Cemetery, which is a private cemetery in Forest Gate, or near Forest Gate. And So after Anna Robinson's research, she actually back in 2003 located this grave, but then, didn't go back again. But she told me and my husband the grave reference, and we went to the cemetery and we spent all day looking for this grave. And we were then quite excited and dismayed to find it, because as you can see, she's got absolutely no marking. This was grave 113 and this was 115 or something like that. She's grave 114 in the middle, and it was just being used as a footpath. People were just trampling over it, and I thought, after everything she'd been through in her life, and here she is just being trampled over. So we very quickly got some sort of branches and put them around the edge, and went and bought a flower and put it on top just to try and stop people walking on it. And my husband made her a temporary wooden cross, which we erected on her grave. But then we spoke to the cemetery, and they had done this process of mounding, which means that they reclaim areas where people have been buried. They basically, it's a very brutal process. They remove all the headstones, and I can I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. They remove all the headstones. They then clear the whole area with a bulldozer, and there's no trace of anybody that was there before. And then they pile on new earth. They put 4 feet of new earth on. Well, everybody knows the phrase 6 feet under, so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out when they bury new people in the new mounded area, they're necessarily going to dig into the old graves and disturb the people that are already there. So I think this is awful. We mounted a social media campaign, and we had nearly 10,000 people signed a petition to stop this. But because they're a private cemetery, they can do what they like. And we had the backing of MPs, of the local councillors, the mayors, and we wrote to the Ministry of Justice, and basically the Ministry of Justice said there's nothing we can do. So they didn't do anything. So ultimately what happened is this area did actually get reclaimed, and it was mounded over. So we've now lost this area, except for we actually paid a digital company to go and measure the exact spot of where Sarah is. And we also got the cemetery to agree to put a box around her with some 4 poles, so that at least we did save her from the indignity of being gone over with a JCB. We couldn't stop her being mounded, but at least we know where she is. And I now have the option to rebuy the plot. And they're giving me a discount of only £2,000, lucky me, to buy this plot so that we can actually give her a proper headstone. Now, with the help of some unions, they donated some money towards it. We actually had this headstone made for her, which we had made in 2019 when the cemetery told me they were not going to mound over Sarah's area. So we had this made in good faith. And then they said, oh no, actually, we are going to mound it. So we've had this in storage now since 2019 and desperate to put it on her grave. But we can't do that because they've only just mounded the area this year. So we have to wait for the soil to settle. And I'll just give you a few images of what it looks like when they mound. So here's the headstones. They clear them away. This is a pot that once said mother. You can see that there's no respect whatsoever. They flatten the area, and then they mound it over, and then they grass it. And so that's basically what they do. And there's nobody that can stop anything that they do because they're private cemetery, completely don't have to. Municipal cemeteries can't do this, but they can do what they like because it's private cemetery. So the other unfortunate thing about this was in the same area as Sarah was all the victims of the Bethnal Green tube disaster were all in that area as well. So they've all gone. And the worst thing in my mind as well is the cemetery do not keep a record. They've got the record to say, oh, Joe Bloggs is buried in plot 7C or whatever, but they don't keep a map. So when I go to visit my great-grandfather, Charles, or either of their 2 children that were also buried there, all I know is that there's this vast area, and somewhere in there I can't go to the site because they haven't, municipal cemeteries have to keep that record. They have to make a map, but private ones don't. So it's a terrible thing. And even when the contractors who did the mounding, I think one was Spanish and one was Polish, and we spoke to them and they said they nearly didn't take the job because they thought it was so awful. They said in our country they wouldn't do this. They wouldn't have this lack of respect. So anyway, we can't do anything about it now. It's done. As I said, the one saving grace is I know that Sarah was not driven over with a JCB, and I know that she's there still in her space. We know where she is, and we have the headstone, and we will put that up. And if you sign up to our newsletter, we will have a ceremony about it at some stage when we re-erect her headstone. And you know, if anybody's interested, you can come along. So, because of all of these things that I've told you today, this is such a remarkable story. I think you may get the gist that I actually think it's quite wonderful. So I thought something needs to be done to memorialise this event, this Matchgirls Strike. What they did, those girls, back in 1888 was rather wonderful. So I thought we ought to start a charity so that we can raise some funds to actually have a proper lasting memorial for them. So we started this charity. It was just me and my husband to start with. Anna Robinson, I've told you about already. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Anna. I always thank her for that. Other trustees that we took on, Fiona Castle, she's actually the great-great-granddaughter of Annie Besant. So we're grateful to have her on board. Polly, she's a wonderful young, what is she? She's an award-winning writer and script writer. So these two here are kind of activists in the East End and in Labour history. This is my cousin Carol, who takes the minutes for us. She's also Sarah's great-granddaughter. And this is my dad, who's Sarah's grandson. And then we also have a lovely bunch of ambassadors who work with us to spread the word and to help us. There's people from unions and TUC, a counsellor, all sorts of people, a musician, lots of wonderful people. And then our patrons are Anita Dobson, who I'm sure most of you will have heard of, and Diana Holland and Barbara Plant, who are kind of quite high up in their respective unions of Unite and GMB. So we're very, very, I mean, as you can imagine, this story it has an attraction for lots of people for lots of reasons. There's people who've learnt about it at school. There's people who have, you know, a connection through their family, like me. There's people who think it's a wonderful story because it's, you know, because of the union history. There's people who have very political thoughts about this strike. So it attracts all sorts of different people for all sorts of different reasons. And I think that's what makes it such a great story. So we think that the Match Girls deserve to be memorialised. And so that's what we're all working for. And one particular thing we'd like to do is get them a statue. And not least because of the dire need for more statues to commemorate women in the UK. These figures were from 2018, so they're a little bit out of date, but there were only 828 statues in the UK in 2018. If you take out all of the non-fictional women, royals, naked nymphs, angels, animals, if you take all of those out, you're left with 27 statues of women with a name. And that has changed because in the last few years, quite a few more have gone up. I mean, I'm in contact with quite a few other female statue campaigners. And I know that quite a few have gone up. Actually, Emmeline Pankhurst, Lily Parr, who was a footballer. Back in May this year, I went to the unveiling of Mary Anning, who was a paleontologist in the 1700s who'd been overlooked because, you know, all of her work was credited to the men and she'd been overlooked, but now they've actually recognised her and got this wonderful statue to her down in Lyme Regis. So if you ever go on holiday down there, do look it out. It's a wonderful statue. So the first thing that happened was that we've supported this campaign for some years to get an English heritage blue plaque on the statue, on the factory. So this is the old factory. And on the 5th of July, the anniversary of the strike this year, we were very pleased to have Anita Dobson unveil the plaque. And these were a bunch of the descendants that I'd managed to track down and get to come along. This chap here is Andy Reagan, who's Alice Francis's grandson, and a whole host of others. Unfortunately, my dad couldn't make it. As I said, he's in Cornwall, but we will get him to London at some stage soon. We also, another thing that is very important to us is the education aspect of this. So we tried to work with local education, with local schools, with local community groups, and that's part of the reason I'm here with you tonight, because I love to get the word out to community groups and far and wide, you know, tell people about the story, to keep it alive, to tell, to revive the memories of the older generation, but also to bring the story to the new generation so people can be inspired by it. So we're interested in, we've worked with another organisation who are trying to get a mural. They want to work with the schools to get the schools' ideas to feed into a mural for the Matchgirls. So a local resident heard me on the radio a couple of years ago, and he was inspired to tell Tower Hamlets Council that he thought a new block of social housing should be named after Sarah Chapman, because he'd heard me talking about the Matchgirls. So that house is due to be opened or unveiled officially in January next year. So that's obviously, that is something I'm going to get my dad to London for, definitely. So there's all sorts of things. We'd love to put plaques on places. As I told you earlier, the Gladstone statue, that'd be a great place for a plaque to explain what happened there. Where Sarah lived, where they had their first meeting at Stepney Green Farm, there's an old ruin of the Stepney Green meeting hall where they first had their union meeting. We could put a plaque there to explain why that's, what happened there. So things like that, all of these things we're trying to do, and all the while doing workshops and talks with schools and local communities. And as I said, we do want to get plaques for the individuals as well. And these little ribbons here, we produced these with the help of Unite the Union a few years ago, and we got every single MP to have one of these. We sent 600 and whatever it is ribbons out in the post, and on the backing card it says all of the names of the strike and union committees, as I said earlier. But if anybody wants one of these, please do come and grab one afterwards. You're welcome to have them. So, as I said, education and awareness is very important to us. We want to tell this important story. We want to get the word out. I want to hear from descendants. If anybody has any story related to the factory, or if they know a descendant, or if they just did something great to do with being in a Matchgirls play, for example, any story that's related to the Matchgirls, I'd be really grateful to hear of it, because we have a little space on our website where we publish stories about this, and it just adds to the interest. And to me, our website is like another living memorial of the Matchgirls, because it tells the story, it brings in all sorts of different strands. As I've spoken about the education, we're doing things through drama and music and poetry. We had an adult poetry competition a couple of years ago. The entries were so good that we actually produced this little book, which is on sale tonight. Bargain price, normally £10, £8 to you tonight. So if anybody's interested in one of those, please do help yourself. We have all the poetries on our website, and I've already told you about the blue plaque. So just to tell you a little bit more about the plays, this is quite an interesting story in itself. My husband's done quite a lot of extensive research into this. Now, a guy called Robert Mitchell back in 1940 wrote a play about the Matchgirls. He was doing this for the Unity Theatre up in Manchester, and he had a researcher called Helen Dibley who went down to London and actually interviewed some of the remaining, those still alive, the Matchgirls who'd been in the strike of 1888. So who knows? We've never found these archives, but she may have spoken to Sarah Chapman. She may have spoken to Kate Sclater. What we do know is that some of the cast in this play were called Kate and Sarah, etc., etc. So it could be that he was inspired by those interviews. That play then was picked up by a chap called Bill Owen, who some of you may know better as Compo from Last of the Summer Wine. He wrote this play, The Matchgirls. The music was by Tony Russell, and that's an interesting story in itself, because Tony Russell's daughter, Anita Scorer, contacted me about 2 months ago and said, I'd really like to talk to you because we're trying to get these plays back off the ground. And there's two versions of Bill's play. There's the professional version that was put on at the Globe in 1966. Well, it started at Leatherhead, that went to the Globe in the West End, and it was on in 1966. And then, because there were some stage props, etc., that were quite difficult to translate to an amateur production, he then sanctioned the production of an amateur version, which is quite widely put on. And there's a lady in the audience, sorry, I don't know your name, but who played Annie Besant in a play about 20 years ago of the Matchgirls. So if you know this lady, then do go and get the story from her afterwards. Also, there was another, I mean, there'd never been a musical about the Matchgirls. In 1966, there's two in the same year. So one's at the Globe, one's at the Piccadilly, and this one was written by Joyce Adcock and starred Jeannie Carson, who some of you may remember. She was quite famous in her day. And what was interesting to me about this particular one is her lead character is Sarah Chapman, and no other character has a surname, and no other play has a character with a surname. So I'd be, unfortunately Joyce is no longer with us, so I can't ask, but her daughter lives in Crete and we know her, and there may just be, she's got an interesting archive there that we could have a rifle through. So as well as the plays, poetry I've mentioned. Poetry is quite important to us, so we've had these two competitions with children and with adults. But back in 2012, when the Olympics was on, the Olympic Committee commissioned Lem Sissay, who's quite a famous poet. Some of you may have heard of him. And he was commissioned to write a poem for the Olympic Park. And you can see that the poem is inscribed on the side of this transformer box. It's still there today. I think there's about 20 works of art still there today if you go and walk around. The reason he wrote this, he called it the Spark Catchers, was because he went to the Olympic site for inspiration. And as he looked across the Olympic site back towards the west, he could see the match factory in the distance. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. And he went to research it. And one of the things that Annie Besant had written in her White Slavery in London article was, failing a poet to tell this story, she felt she was telling the story for the poet. He thought, well, here I am, I'm the poet, I'm going to tell the story. So he wrote this wonderful poem called Spark Catchers for the Olympics, and it's still there to this day. In fact, it got a little bit grubby a couple of years ago, and we spotted that, so we actually wrote to the Olympic Park, said, can you spruce it up a little bit, please, so people can actually still see the benefit of it. And then music is also very important. This young composer, Hannah Kendall, she had her world premiere in the Albert Hall in 2017 of a piece of music that she wrote called Spark Catchers, inspired by this poem. So you can see how every little aspect of music, drama, the Matchgirls creep in everywhere, which is wonderful. And that premiere that she did was performed by the Chingford Orchestra, and that was the very first time that the Chingford Orchestra, who are kind of multicultural orchestra, had played at the Albert Hall. So that was another remarkable moment in itself. And then art. There's a wonderful artist called Laura Greenan, who produced this artwork that was part of a Transport for London museum art competition, and she's actually donated a number of these to us for our charity so that we can sell them in aid of the work that we're doing. So as you can see, the breadth of what we're trying to cover here is quite enormous, and I sometimes wonder, I've got time to actually go to work and do my day job. So that's basically it. Just to let you know, if anybody felt moved to give a donation, we have a website called Givey. If you want to come to us and either sign up for the website to get newsletters, or to just give us your feedback. If you've got any ideas about where you think a statue should go, or if you think we shouldn't have a statue, or if you think anything I've said is a great idea or a terrible idea, we want to hear all of your feedback. And this is our website. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you pick up one of these, you can see the website and the email address is on here as well, and there's some statue flyers here as well, which you're welcome to take. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Sam. That was fascinating. But I would like to throw it out to the audience now. Do we have any questions that you'd like to ask? I've got to come around with the microphone, so bear with us.
Yeah, the first thing, thank you for a very detailed, analysis of the strike and, the component parts of it. My question would be to do with the white phosphorus chemical. You mentioned that the Liberal government, obviously it came in 1906. Obviously they were hell-bent on social reform, but they eventually outlawed it in 1911 under Lord George and Asquith. But why wasn't something done before? Because, and to what extent were the Matchgirls damaged? And is there any kind of cataloguing of their injuries?
So why they didn't do it before, I think, was just, as I said, down to money. Now, an interesting side story to that is that back in the 1890s, the Salvation Army actually opened another match factory not very far from Bryant and May, and they produced matches with better pay for the workers and with red phosphorus. And the reason they did this was not because they wanted to get into matchmaking. They wanted to prove that it could be done. They wanted to prove that you could actually run a business using red phosphorus, and which was much safer for the workers. And eventually, Bryant and May actually bought that factory out as well. So everybody knew about the dangers. And there was the Berne Convention in 1906, which actually the UK decided not to go to. The Berne Convention was talking all about signing up to stopping the use of phosphorus. And we know that, I think it was Finland that stopped using it first, and they were way, way back, like in 1850 or 60, something like that. So the dangers were very firmly known about, but it's just, as you say, the government of the day weren't inclined to push it, because obviously matches at the time were big business and it made a huge amount of money. And we know from Robert Lowe trying to tax, he tried to tax the matches. The government would do anything they could to try and make some more money out of this business for themselves. So I have not got any other evidence of what it could be apart from being driven by economics. And unfortunately, I'm not saying there isn't one, but I'm not aware of a catalogue of any of the things that have happened. I know if you Google fuzzy jaw or osteonecrosis, you can see some hideous pictures. And I think there have been perhaps some medical journals that have investigated phosphorus, but I can't actually quote them to tell you what they are. But yeah, it was a pretty hideous disease.
Any other questions, please, from the audience?
Two online.
Okay. Do you want to do that one?
Okay. Leslie has asked, so I'll just scroll back. Did Barbara Windsor's family work at Bryant and May?
So I know that Barbara was interviewed for a Who Do You Think You Are programme, I think, and definitely she said that she had somebody. I don't know who it was. I think she did have perhaps an auntie. I'm not sure if it was a direct ancestor, but I think she did have some link. At least that's what they said on the telly. So who am I to question that? Sorry?
She was a bit prone to exaggeration.
Oh, right.
So I've just got a comment from Simon G online saying thank you. Well, actually, he's thanking us as well as you, but I'll read it out because he's thanking you. So thank you to everyone involved in organising and presenting tonight's superb evening. The talk was fascinating and engaging, and the interval archive films were excellent. I've told him that we've got DVDs for sales.
Okay, any other questions? Anyone else got a question they'd like to ask Sam? Anyone out there? No? Okay, so I've got a quick question actually. It's probably more about where Sarah is buried. You say it was a private, it's a private crematorium, but was it public cemetery? Sorry, was it public back in her day when she was buried there?
No.
So if it was private then, does that suggest that she was quite wealthy at the time?
No, because she
Right.
was in a pauper's grave.
Right.
Just as an interesting aside about the Bryant and May cemetery, at the time, so the cemetery opened in, I can't remember the exact year, but it was in the early 1800s, and it was the time that the railroads were being built, and they had a right to purchase land, and the only reason they couldn't purchase land is if it was a cemetery. So Bryant and May, being good businessmen, that they are not Bryant and May. What am I talking about? The owners of the cemetery were you know, they were canny businessmen, and they knew the only way they could stop their land being taken by a compulsory purchase was to turn it into a cemetery. And if you go up to the railway line at Manor Park, the oldest graves are the ones that were right along the line of where the railway line runs. So it's all about money and business.
There's an adjunct to that, which is that it wasn't only the railways, but it was actually all of the developers of the housing that was built in that whole area of Manor Park. And it was conditional, and it was an agreement between the housing developers and the company that actually owned the cemetery in the first place.
Okay.
Did a deal and made sure that, because it was conditional, that, you know, as generations died in this huge, and it was a huge new development, housing development, that it was one of the provisions that they had to have for a cemetery.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, interesting. I mean, I'm sure the people that live in those houses now would not be quite so happy, because the mounding has taken the area so high that they look out their bedroom window and they're basically looking across to the gravestones, because it's come up so high now. It's the residents aren't very happy about it at all anymore. But they may well have been back in the day.
Any other questions? No? Well, on behalf of Chingford Historical Society, Sam, I'd like to thank you very much for coming along this evening to tell this story. It's certainly a story that's new to me. I'm sure a lot of people here this evening thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much indeed. One big round of applause. Thank you.